The value of data. The data that the Leipzig Computer Center generates, processes, stores, and transports are of interest for science, business, and society at large, indeed of great value. So I don't want to conclude my presentation with that, but want to give you two examples of the value of data in the gleaning of knowledge for science as a result of the use of supercomputers on the basis of scientific data. And secondly, second major area of research at the Leipzig Center is the archiving and provision of the cultural heritage by means of the archiving of the holdings of the Bavarian State Library that for the past 450 years has maintained the cultural heritage in Europe. The Leipzig Computing Center, with its building at the front. In the background, you can see part of our customers. The Faculty of Mathematics at the Technical University in Munich has 200 members of staff and looks after 150,000 customers in a greater Munich area in research and scientific establishments there. But as a result of the centralization of IT services, it makes it possible for it to take on an over-regional, super-regional character when it comes to services for the Bavarian Association of Libraries, and it takes on an international character when it comes to supercomputers, the Partnership for Advanced Computing in Europe. So this is an infrastructure which provides scientists with 24 European countries with access to supercomputers by means of a common infrastructure. Now, I've had a look at Google. I looked at the value of data in early September and had 38,600,000 scores, but the first scores were provided relevant information on the issue of the value of data. So first and foremost, I need to point out that the data are of very different character and of very different values too. There are personal data, of course, and then there are the data used by scientists. The data used by scientists is a point of departure for their work, and data that are generated by science and lead to new findings, of course. And ultimately, there is a large area of economically used data, in other words, data that are used for production purposes. You can see data restoration costs in the corporate environment. This is an indication of how valued these data are and what infrastructure is involved. Now, there's something that I can't go into detail here this morning. Therefore, I'm going to restrict myself in my presentation to the data that are used as information for science and research. The Leipzig Computing Center of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, with its dark center, has essentially 5 major functions. It runs the SuperMUC, the biggest supercomputer in Europe. It has a large archive store for the Bavarian libraries, but also for the archiving of the associated 90,000 computers with backup in the Munich computer network. It connects scientists internationally via the information network. It provides opportunity for visualization in a special visualization environment with Powerwall and Cave. And finally, on the basis of around 2,000 servers, which are also operated in this dark center, it also provides basic IT services for music business world, from email right on up to backup and archiving services. Now, the dark center is dark because it cannot be used by people during the day. The reason for this is that the fire extinguishing mechanism operates on an argon gas basis, and because all the computers that are operating there basically can be operated from outside by this scientific network. Now, the dark center is something special because it runs on a very good energy efficiency basis. It will cost 8 million to run this center, And we have known since yesterday how much the price is going to increase by, for power that is, for electricity, in the course of the coming year here in Germany. Now, let me begin with the processing of data, first of all, by means of supercomputers. Now, this film that you can see here is a simulation right down to the last detail of the SuperMOC computer, which is produced by the SuperMOC computer itself. Now, what is special about the computer is that it has 160,000 processor cores that are all linked with each other via means of the yellow cables that you can see here on the picture here. And the computer is very efficient in terms of its use of energy. So this is an example here of the computer, and this means that the hottest components can be cooled. So the copper pipes here are used run over these elements. So this means that you can make savings by not having the energy-intensive coolers that you would normally have employed. Now, I've just said that the computer is the biggest in Europe. It's the most efficient, fourth efficient throughout the world. And even though it has no special accelerators as graphic processors and so on and so forth, just standard processors of the kind you also have in your PC or laptop or mobile devices. Now, science depends on data, and you can see this on this flow chart here of the computer. I would just like your attention to the corners. At the corners, at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a 10 petabyte large parallel data system by means of which the data to be processed are transported to the cores. Here on the left-hand bottom, you see it's all steered by a 1.5 petabyte large NAS system. And the right top-hand corner, you can see the present archive that has 30 petabyte capacity and will be boosted to 120 petabyte next year. That corresponds to the storage capacity of around 100 million Bibles. Or if you were to measure that in terms of Gutenberg Bibles, you would have a stack of around 10,000 kilometers in height. So what are we doing with the data? Well, per year, using our computer at the Leipzig Computing Center, we have 100 different scientific groups working on the issues that are of interest to them. Now, on this pie chart here, you can see that there's virtually everything that is included here, from medicine right on up to typical engineering sciences. Of course, there is a main focus on basic research, astrophysics, solid-state physics, prediction of tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on and so forth. So let me come on now to 4 simple examples. One of the first applications that was used on the SuperMOC is the virtual car, and this is the result of cooperation with Audi. And here you have a realistic picture of an Audi. It's not a photograph. This is a computed picture based on millions of dots, and of course, this must be produced as close as possible to the original. Well, when manufacturing a new type of car, it must be possible to modify aspects of this virtual car before a decision is made to produce a new type of car. The next example comes from the realm of science and is run by a group of scientists at the University of Stuttgart, which runs the Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy. It's talking about the Boeing 747. This is a telescope which is transported in the Boeing 747. Although in the rear part of the aircraft there is an opening here, which means that if the aircraft has reached a height of 14 kilometers, is opened, so there is a free view, an unhindered view of what's going on outside in space. So the opening during flight leads to an acoustic shock wave in the aircraft. So during the first experiments that were carried out, the telescope started to vibrate quite startlingly, and the images could not be used properly as a result. As a result of flow simulation, then, an attempt was made to show how the external shell of the aircraft can be designed in such a way that the shock wave can be reduced, and ultimately this led to a better mode of performance on the part of the stratospheric telescope. On now to another example. Here, people living close to airports, subjected to noise disturbance, want to have ever quieter aircraft as one of the major tasks facing engineers in future, using fluid dynamics to come up with new types of turbines that will cause much less noise. The example you can see here comes from cooperation with a faculty at the Technical University in Berlin with the company Rolls-Royce. Finally, one example from classical natural sciences here, the depiction of the GOI. This shows the situation as it is. And here you can see what's the gravity situation like here. You see it's important for the flow of the seas and changes in the world at large. So you can see this is a project that was carried out at the Technical University in Munich.
Now, with this, I've described 4 areas where we are processing data and where each of the applications uses millions of individual data and millions of pieces of data that need to be further processed. One of the classic tasks of our computing center is mass digitization of the library stock. The Bavarian State Library is one of the biggest collectors of our intellectual heritage, has entered into a public-private partnership project with Google and the Leibniz Rechenzentrum in 2007, started to develop a project focusing on the digitization of the entire non-copyright archive of the Bavarian State Library. So more than 1 million books and magazines, and until this very day, more than 75% of the entire stock has been digitized together with Google. And the task was carried out in a PPP project because if we'd used only the funds from Bavaria, we would have probably taken more than 50 years to achieve that. So it's a clear win-win situation in this cooperation with Google. Now, access to this data is possible via Google Book Search and via Google Web Search, as well as via access through the Bavarian State Library. The Bavarian State Library continues to be one of the owners of the digitized books, and even if the company Google were to disappear, which is quite improbable, but if this were to happen, these digitized versions would still be available to the world. Now, access to the European cultural heritage is also supported by the Munich Center for Digitization, MDZ, which makes additional digital versions available. If you access this website, you see the current state of available titles in the top right-hand corner. So this is a task that is currently being developed and which also is introduced into the European digital library. So you would then have millions of digitized versions. So this is a presentation of the existing stock of the past years. And if you look at the last line here, if you can read it, you see that the share of digitized versions that are made available to Europe from the Bavarian State Library by means of our Leibniz Institute constitutes a very high share of the European cultural heritage. But we also have special projects supported by the German Research Society and the Bavarian State Library. This focuses on a digitization of the literature of the 16th century. The Bavarian State Library is the biggest European owner of writings from the 16th century, so you can see that there are specialized robots that digitize the valuable original pieces in a very cautious and careful way. Now, what is happening to this data? First, the data is transported to a very, very big tape library with the 120 petabyte capacity that it will soon have. And even if there were a disaster in the Leibniz Computing Center and these volumes would no longer exist physically, they're all mirrored, i.e. copied, and then stored on another tape library, which is geographically removed from the Bavarian State Library. This is located at the Max Planck Society, and we also have copies of all of the data on the computing center of the Max Planck Society. So the physical base for this entire storage is a huge tape recorder. This is just a picture of one part of the computer where 10,000 individual tapes are stored, and of those in the future about 1 dozen will be operated in the Leibniz Center. Now, I haven't spoken that much on the topic of security. I'd just like to point out that the Leibniz Center is also responsible with regard to training new scholars together with the Bavarian Academy of Sciences and Fraunhofer Institution. We have carried out training measures for Bavarian students on, for example, the issue of security and trust on the internet. Now, let me summarize the value of data in science and academia. Data is the prerequisite, the object, and the result of science. Data transport our cultural heritage, and that is why data have to be free, they have to be stored efficiently and in a secure way, and they have to be accessible in a free, efficient, and secure way. This accessibility and the freedom of access have to be clearly guaranteed through the physical possession of data by the public hand. So that's why the Leibniz Center is a public institution. But the costs for the task of storing and digitization cannot always be covered by the state. And that is why the digitization project was carried out as a task shared between the Bavarian State Library and the Leibniz Center, so a PPP model. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we promised you that you will also have the possibility of having a dialogue with us. Do you have questions? Please use a microphone for the questions, otherwise there cannot be a translation because the interpreters cannot hear the question. Answer: that depends on how long it takes for the robot to work with these tapes. Between 1 second, maximum of 1 minute. Again, please use the microphone. Well, during this project, all of those volumes in the Bavarian State Library were digitized that no longer had a copyright. The results that were generated were one copy of the data that remains in public hand, i.e. With the Bavarian State Library, and are thus made available to the users that are independent of Google. In addition to this, Google also received a copy because it financed the entire task of digitization, And this copy can be made available by Google by means of its way of publishing these copies for its users. Answer to the next question that wasn't heard was yes. Accessibility to the data. Even though a lot of data was digitized, it's still not yet clearly accessible to the users, and users don't know about the accessibility. It's not used frequently enough. Why do you think that is, even though the data is freely available? Well, that is quite surprising to a certain degree, because the project of Europeana first and foremost failed because the frequency of access was underestimated and all of the servers that were built up collapsed, and then they had to set up a larger server structure for half a year because there was such a high volume of access. In Germany, the idea of having one joint big German digital library is something that's currently developing, and that's why marketing this functionality is something that hasn't yet been transferred to the end users. I think it's going to take 1 to 2 years as a maximum until you will no longer store your data locally, for example, with the Bavarian State Library, but you will immediately, if you want to have access to this data, go through this joint project, and German Research Society is currently funding one of these big projects that focuses on setting up the technical prerequisites for such a joint German project. If I may add, there's also an app by the Bavarian State Library where you can go leaf through the Gutenberg Bible. I don't know how many documents you can reach through this app, but you can do it. The Fugger family was also mentioned. There are a lot of interesting old digital volumes of books from the Fugger heritage. I have a question of understanding on the actual cooling technology. Can you give me concrete figures? What's the percentage point that the energy use is reduced by with the cooling technology that you're using? Now, if you go back in time by 5 years, in a classic computing center, about 47% of the energy was used for the operation of the computers. 53% was used for the infrastructure, particularly cooling, but also for lighting of the building and locking mechanisms and so on. Now, with our computers, we now have a ratio of 90 to 10. So 90% of the energy is used for the operation of the computer, and only 10% are used for the actual cooling. So we've seen a drastic decrease of energy consumption for cooling. And if you keep in mind that we pay 8 million euros for energy every year, it's quite a difference whether you have 50% or 10% for cooling. And we're not exempt from renewable energy surcharge. Sometimes I was surprised when I read the news because they were too simple. They simplified facts. Computing centers are part of the producing industry, and not all of them are included in the tax exemptions, and scientific computing centers are definitely not exempt. We pay per kilowatt hour. With the new laws, we pay about 20 cents per kilowatt hour. A big computing center in the United States pays about 2 US cents. Now, if you take the entire stock of the state library and make it available to every user just like that, aren't there people who say, we don't want that because you are doing away with jobs? The valuables have to be defended and have to be protected. Maybe there are some people who are against Google making the knowledge of the world available to everybody. Well, if I can quote the leaders of the Bavarian State Library, they say libraries will not disappear. They only will play a different role in the future, and you have to ensure that access to documents that used to be very difficult in the past, just because of the danger that some of the documents might be damaged by the use, by being touched. That access has to be made available now, and we have to create a situation where we have a big use by the end users in the digitized version, and a lot needs to be done. But the question was raised that this function, this possibility needs to be marketed first and foremost. So there was a rethinking process that took place. Yes. Now, let's leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to the head of the Munich Leibniz Computing Center, Professor Dr. Arndt Bode.